Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. Today, I want to talk about anchoring, specifically whether you're anchoring your company to the wrong data. Now, what's up with anchoring? What is this concept, and why is it bad? Well, anchoring has to do with how we perceive information, how we hear information, and how we get attached to the initial information we hear on any topic. So, any topic, whether we learn about a person, or an event, or development, business trend, technology, the first piece of information that we hear about the topic tends to very much anchor us and color our future impressions of this topic. It's very hard for us to switch our perspective from this initial anchor. So what happens is that the initial piece of information, especially if it comes from a source that we trust, that we perceive as creditable, valuable, that it's trustworthy, we tend to see all of this information through this lens. All the information that we're getting through the lens of that initial information. That's why it's especially important to be careful about the first information you hear and to be very willing to update your mind, to change your mind based on new evidence. Because most of us don't, actually. This is a tendency, a cognitive bias, a dangerous judgment error called anchoring. So if you've been checking out the Wise Decision Maker show for a while, you know I talk about cognitive biases quite often. So these are the dangerous judgment errors that cause us to make really bad decisions, to have bad perspectives on reality, to not see reality as it is, and then come to wrong conclusions, whether in business, whether in life, all of these sorts of things. So you got to be very careful about anchoring, because often when new evidence is actually quite a bit more persuasive objectively, when you're looking from the outside, you will tend not to update your beliefs, to change your mind based on this new evidence. You'll tend to stick to what you know. It's comfortable. That's what our gut intuition tells us to do, to stick to what we know, to our pre-existing beliefs, conceptions, information, and then not change our minds based on new evidence. So you have to watch out for this anchoring. It's a pretty bad tendency. As an example, let's think about this pandemic, the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Huge example of anchoring. I've been so frustrated with so many people who have been anchored on the initial information they received. So that's been pretty bad. Really bad. I mean, you probably know that, let's say, the Centers for Disease Control, they changed their guidance based on new evidence. So they came out with some initial guidance, said, prepare for 2-week disruption or something like that. And, don't need to wear masks, that COVID-19 spreads mainly through touching surfaces. Over time, they changed their guidance. They said that, no, you actually need to prepare for a much longer disruption than 2 weeks. It's going to be much more serious, that COVID-19 mainly spreads through airborne particles, and that you actually do need masks that are very protective, especially protective of it helps you protect yourself when you wear a mask, and it helps protect other people from if you have COVID-19 without knowing it, because so many of us are asymptomatic when we have COVID-19. This new information, this is how science works. You get new information and you change your beliefs. And this is how business works. How it should work. You get new information and you change your beliefs based on this new information. So that's, unfortunately, many business leaders don't approach business this way, even though they should. They stick to their initial decision. They say, okay, we made this decision and therefore we're going to stick to it. That's what makes us good leaders. That's a terrible perspective. And that is one of the worst aspects of anchoring, this really negative impact on leadership, where leaders perceive themselves as having to stick to their initial judgment. So they got some initial information, they stick to it, even though new information should cause them to change their minds. And this is how you make the biggest profit in business and how you protect your health in this pandemic. So another aspect of anchoring with COVID-19 was that there were a number of recent pandemics, the H1N1 flu, the swine flu, all of these pandemics that had an impact in Asia or Africa, or the Ebola virus, that didn't really have much of an impact in the United States. I mean, some impact, of course, but not a huge impact, not nearly as big as COVID-19. So folks, anchored on their previous impressions. You don't necessarily anchor on the immediate thing you hear about COVID-19. You can anchor on your previous impressions of pandemics as a whole. So that's another tendency that we have, anchoring on previous information that we got about the topic and not changed our minds about based on new evidence which showed that COVID-19 is clearly going to be much worse than these other pandemics. Then, of course, many leaders unfortunately compared COVID-19 to the flu. Elon Musk famously compared COVID-19 to the flu. Many other business leaders, as well as other leaders, political leaders, civic leaders, comparing COVID-19 to the flu. Of course, that's a bad comparison, as we know now. I mean, many people wish really we knew it then, and these leaders had perhaps some ulterior motives for comparing COVID-19 to the flu, based on them not wanting to disrupt their business processes and so on, which really is not a good idea, because in the end, of course, it's much better to face reality, accept reality, rather than hope for and wish for an optimistic outcome, which is definitely not going to come. COVID-19, of course, is much more deadly than the flu, about 5 to 10 times more deadly. And it seems about as contagious, maybe even more contagious. More problematically, we don't have any defenses against COVID-19, whereas, of course, against the flu, we have a number of treatments, and we also have vaccines, which are somewhat effective. So that's a bad comparison, even though it's much more contagious and much more deadly than the flu. So those are some bad tendencies when comparing and COVID-19, when anchoring to initial evidence you heard on COVID-19, whether about masks, whether about its comparison to the flu, whether previous pandemics. And this is something that unfortunately a lot of companies run into. So for example, one of my consulting clients was a company, a fintech company, 130 people, fintech company in Texas, which initially the CEO and so on, the C-suite, had an impression of COVID-19 as no worse than the flu, not a big deal, don't really need to prepare for any serious disruptions. And so they didn't treat it seriously. Well, unfortunately, not treating it seriously, not instituting the kind of precautions that the CDC mandated as something that really businesses should be doing, led to a major outbreak in the office, and including some C-suite leaders got sick. The COO had to go to the hospital, and a couple of employees, not C-suite level, but older employees died. It was really bad. And the company got into a lot of trouble with employee morale. People didn't have good retention. They had bad customer service, of course, because of all these disruptions. So the CEO called me once she saw me on a podcast talking about how business leaders needed a webinar, and talking about how business leaders need to pivot for the COVID-19 pandemic and for the post-COVID future. And so we talked about the situation, and I pointed out how anchoring, they really should have known by May, which is when this outbreak happened, and when they saw me on the webinar and called me, that there was a lot of new information about COVID-19 being much more deadly than the flu, that you really need to take these guidelines from the CDC seriously. And especially Texas was a problematic situation because it didn't close in nearly timely enough manner and reopened way too fast. And so there was a huge surge in cases, and that was pretty bad around that timeline with April, May, June. So that was pretty bad, and they really should have done much more to protect themselves. So we talked about that. We talked about anchoring. We talked about the kind of strategies that they needed to actually improve their performance. And they went off on a good path after that. They changed their program. Previously, they mandated all employees to come back to the office when Texas reopened, which was way too fast, and that's where they had the outbreak. And so instead of that, they rolled out a work from home program, had everyone who wanted to work from home, you can come into the office, but they discouraged people from doing so. So only people who really needed to come to the office chose to come to the office. And so that was much more helpful, helped improve employee retention, employee morale, and got the company going off on the right tracks. So that's the kind of problems that we experience, business leaders experience, and professionals experience of all sorts when they anchor to the wrong data, whether in the pandemic or any other business development, whether the idea that their product will be great in the marketplace, despite evidence showing that it's not great in the marketplace. There's a reason about 70 to 80% of all product launches fail because people are too anchored to the initial impressions. They think the product will be good, and they tend to only look at information showing that it's good, ignore information that the marketplace is not as receptive to the product as you wanted. So there are so many other tendencies in business where anchoring trips folks up. And you gotta watch out for these tendencies, and you have to protect yourself and your business from anchoring. All right, so this was another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, and I hope you've found this episode beneficial. Please follow us on whatever media you enjoyed this episode. We have both a videos and a podcast version, so make sure to check that out. It'll be in the notes. So if you're checking out on podcast, the video will be notes. If you're checking out the video, the podcast will be notes in the notes, so you can check those out and follow us in the other formats as well as on your favorite formats, whether iTunes, YouTube, wherever. You'll find us across the spectrum. Please click like if you like the episode, and please comment. We really love your comments, and that helps us make the show much better. Same thing for reviews. Please leave a review wherever you heard and saw this episode. Of course, as always, there's a blog with much more information about this show in the notes. So make sure to check out the blog that talks much more about the case study, gives a lot of citations with the scientific evidence behind what I'm talking about, and business evidence. So check that out as well. There are a couple of books that are really relevant to this topic. One is my book called Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Of course, it's about decision-making, risk management, change management. So check that out. And then Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. That's about how do you adapt to COVID-19 and the post-COVID economic and recovery. So check that out. Make sure you read it if you want to protect your business in the context of COVID-19 and the post-COVID recovery, and of course your career as well. You'll want to check out a free resource called the Wise Decision Maker course. This is a free course with 8 video-based modules on making the wisest decisions. Check that out at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. Again, the Wise Decision Maker course, 8 video-based modules on making the wisest decisions at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as always, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.